So, hi everyone. Thanks so much for listening and welcome to the podcast Startup Tribune. I'm really excited to host today Dave Kellogg, who has been a very prominent operator, investor, SaaS expert across the world, who has been on the board of amazing companies like Tableau, Pigment, MongoDB, Alation, and really exciting software companies. And I'm accompanied with Louis, who's our in-house AI expert, so knows just about everything about AI. So we're both really excited to host you, Dave, today, and to hear more about your background and really understand primarily your time at Salesforce. So for all those listening, Dave was at Salesforce some years ago, and we'll be sharing more about one, the company, two, his time there, and three, really how everyone listening can try and think about structuring their tech teams as amazingly as a company like Salesforce. So Dave, I'll leave it on to you. I would love to hear more about your background amongst all the companies that you're currently advising and your journey, really.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for having me. I think I'll paint the trajectory first because Salesforce was a relatively brief stop in my career. I tend to do like 7-year gigs, but it was a time of very high learning for me, and I really enjoyed it. And I learned a lot that I'm happy to share with you on this episode. But let me paint the overall picture and talk about how Salesforce fit in, and then we can zoom back in there. Roughly speaking, I started out technical computer club in middle school, ended up paying for college as a programmer, got a job in tech support. So I entered the enterprise software business as tech support rep, literally telling people how to write SQL queries, and very quickly watched my employer lose to Oracle on this thing called sales and marketing that we were supposedly bad at and they were good at. Now, because we had all the technical talent in the world, including a future Turing Award as one of our founders, future Turing Award winner as one of our founders, right? So we literally had all the technical firepower you could possibly need, and we were losing. That's why I got interested in marketing. So I got an MBA in nights and weekend. I moved to competitive analysis, then product marketing. I switched companies, got a battlefield promotion to VP of marketing. Battlefield promotions when they fire your boss. So they say, hey, you run marketing. So I was probably 28 years old and I find myself running marketing. then I ended up joining Business Objects where I was CMO for 9 years as we grew from 30 million to $1 billion. Gosh, being a CEO looked easy, so I decided to try that. And so I ran a company called MarkLogic from 0 to 80 million. And then after that, after I met MarkLogic, a friend of mine from Business Objects hired me to run the Service Cloud applications there. And so I took over that business unit. I did it for a relatively short time because I think the world, God wanted me, as we say, to be a startup person. So I enjoyed my time a lot at Salesforce, but I was thinking, I got to go run a startup. So I left that and then joined a company called Host Analytics, which I ran for 6 years. Sold to private equity. I've done a lot of advisor gigs and board gigs along the way. Some of the ones you mentioned were board, some were actually advisor gigs, but we can talk about those companies if you want to.
That's amazing. Yeah. No, thanks so much for sharing those details. I think there's very, very few people out there in the world who have as much experience, not just in pure software, but in marketing, sales, and having worked with tech teams. So really having the whole umbrella, as we say, of tech, big tech companies and smaller startups as well. So yeah, I would love to hear more as well about the companies that you support at Balderton. So for everyone listening, sure. Dave is a fantastic advisor to Balderton and some of the amazing companies that they've invested in. Like Gig Guardian, Photo Room more recently, and Aircall. So would love to hear more about, maybe tell us a bit more about these Franco-American ties and some of these amazing companies that you help advise.
Sure. So two things. One, because I think it will be of interest to the audience. As an operator, the one thing you most envy of venture capitalists is they get to work at 10 companies at one time. And we as operators have but one life to give for our company. And because outcomes can be a little bit randomized relative to work, it's very early in my career, I was like, I got to figure out how to work with multiple companies at one time. Because that gets me portfolio theory working to my advantage. So I started sitting on boards while I was CEO of MarkLogic. I was on the board of Alation. I was on the board of Astrodata first. Then I was on the board of a company called Granular. Then I did an angel investment in Alation, the inventor of the data catalog, ended up on their board eventually. But pretty early in the game, I said, I want to be able to have some side bets in addition to my primary bets, and will also tee me up to be an advisor one day. So I did advisor gigs as well. You mentioned Tableau, which I think was my first one. I did Recorded Future as well. I'm currently an advisor to Pigment, a super exciting French company. And you're right. I was also an advisor to Tableau. Each one of these tends to have an amazing story of how I met the founder. And of course, I work with literally scores of Balderton companies, from Aircall to DeepSet to Git Guardian to Hook to Payflows to Photo Room, Tescarilla, Ryder, and literally probably 30 more I've talked to over the last year. So I do a lot of advising for Balderson as well.
That's amazing. Thanks a lot for all those details. And we'll be having future episodes with you to hear more about some of your roles working more closely with these companies, and as well on what kind of databases are used currently. But really for today, I'd love to focus on your time at Salesforce, where you were in 2012. For everyone listening, Dave was working closely with Mark Benioff at the time when Salesforce was a $3 billion company, so very different from now. And so really, my question was, what was it like? Not many people here in the audience probably know what working at Salesforce was like in 2012.
Yeah, so it was a very interesting time to join. So first, the person who hired me, I'll mention him, is Alexandre Daillon, who was the first employee at Business Objects. And he was my colleague for many years. He ran engineering while I ran marketing. And I always think a good sign of a CMO is that they have good relationships with the engineers. If they're only talking to sales and customers, it may not be good. So Alex is a close friend. We worked very closely together for a long time. I invested in his startup as an angel. That startup was later acquired by Salesforce, which is how he came to be there, because Salesforce acquired his basically knowledge-based startup to become really the genesis of the Service Cloud. Because when the Service Cloud was initially created at Salesforce, they just added one object to their schema. They literally just added an object called case, because they had all these other objects, contacts, companies, right? So it was one table that the Service Cloud began with called case, i.e. case number. Like, hey, there's a case, it's owned by an agent, it's got a topic, it's got a status, right? That was the genesis of the Service Cloud. And very quickly, once you have a case object, you get all these ancillary questions like, well, gosh, don't they need a knowledge base so they can resolve the case? Like, oh, darn, yeah, you're right. So boom, that's why they acquired Instranet, which was Alex's company. And then Alex took over and did an amazing job growing the Service Cloud. And the circumstances of my joining Salesforce were, one, I had left MarkLogic. So I was kind of on the street looking for something to do, and Alex just got promoted. They made Alex the head of all CRM, and he needed to backfill himself. So Alex called me and said, hey, why don't you try and take over the Service Cloud, just because it's a fun story. I had previously interviewed at Salesforce for the head of analytics and decided that was basically a suicide mission. I literally said, I love you people, but I'll never take this job because I don't think Salesforce is going to be successful in analytics for these following reasons, at least with the current strategy. So call me back one day when you have quote unquote real job. And that's when Alex called and said, hey, would you like to take over the Service Cloud? And that was very exciting to me.
That's amazing. Wow, what a story.
Right. So I was wondering, the obvious question is, what made Salesforce a successful software company at the time and still now? Do you think it was like more like the structure of the team, the sales efficiency, the culture? So what's the secret sauce, basically?
Super. Let me tell you a little bit more of the picture I was painted in, and then I'll answer that question. So I joined them having been a CEO before, right? I just ran a company from 0 to 80 million. And at the time, the internal name for the SVP GM role was CEO. So I was technically a cloud CEO. So my first question was, I wonder how being a cloud CEO is going to differ from being a real CEO. And the answer is significantly. And despite all the stuff I'd done in my career, I'd never been a GM before, and I'd always wanted to be a GM. So it was kind of coming one step too late in my career progression, right? Most people want to be a GM and then be a CEO. I was kind of doing it backwards, but it was a great company. I loved all the people. I think, as you mentioned, it was $3 billion in size when I got there. My product, the Service Cloud, was 500 million of that 3 billion. So I was the other interesting thing is it was the company's second album, right? We talk about the second album problem. I know you both like music, right? A lot of bands are one-hit wonders. How do you do your second album? Same thing in software companies. How do you do your second product? And this was their second product. And to be honest, that was a huge learning opportunity that I didn't even know I was signing up for. But anyway, and the company was around 6,000 to 7,000 people. The job was in San Francisco, and it was very much an in-office culture. So that's the picture I ran into. Ex-CEO, now cloud CEO, and I'm now basically a product manager on steroids, which is what I call the SVP GM job, right? I'm kind of a product manager with a quota. By the way, I worked for Alex. Alex worked for Mark, which was actually very important because if you didn't have good Mark access, I think it would be a very difficult place to work. So to answer your question directly, I'll pause there if you want any more context, and then we can jump into like why I think it was successful.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting. And having worked at Amazon, thinking about your point about being the Service Cloud CEO versus general CEO, I think you kind of are really shifting tech to the cloud. And it seems like even yesterday, so many companies were still cloud. So it would be interesting to probably find out what percentage of companies still are on premise.
Yeah, change happens very slowly in enterprise software. There's no question. And the bigger the enterprise, the slower the change. But I was a huge believer in cloud because I just came to this conclusion: if I can find a buyer with money, I can go solve their problem. And look, because I'd been in that exact chair, it's like, so it's like if I can solve your problem and you give me money and I have to wait 3 years for internal IT, this is not a difficult decision. So I was a huge cloud believer early on. Now, to answer your question directly, finally, what do I think made Salesforce successful? Let's start at the top with Mark. Visionary leader. Also, by the way, unlike many tech bros, a very decent human being for my relatively limited exposure to him. But I think he's actually a genuinely good guy as a tech leader, and he's got a tremendous vision, tremendous marketer. But by the way, here's a quote for the ages that I came up with: behind every marketing genius stands a large marketing budget, which is true. He had his own kind of personal marketing budget. I can't remember how big it was, and I wouldn't tell you if I could, but he's a marketing genius. And the first step in marketing genius is allocating significant money to the problem. Like, for example, Dreamforce, corporate PR, billboards, and a lot of the PR stunts, which didn't take money. So first thing I'd say is vision. A great job of a company that markets vision. Everyone knows if you saw it at Dreamforce, it's not going to be available for 3 years. And making that a norm is actually very powerful because people rarely call up Salesforce and say, when can I buy the thing I saw at Dreamforce? Right? Because everyone knows you can't. And it's kind of a concept car. So really good job at marketing vision. I think the unsung hero of Salesforce a little bit was Parker Harris. So he was the kind of balance. So you had Mark as the go-to-market visionary and Parker as an eminently competent, low ego, super nice, great guy, product leader. And he was a tremendous balancing force, in my opinion. Marketing, obviously really good. There's an expression in marketing of getting in front of a parade. I think Sam Altman is very good at that, where you find a parade, you don't create it, you just run in front of it and you start conducting. I think Benioff is really, really good at that, right? He's got great sensing. And when he senses something, for example, when I was there, chatter was the thing. So social media was happening and he ran in front of that parade. I think process, if you want, we can drill into that. But I learned a ton about engineering process and Scrum at Salesforce. So that was something else they got really, really right. So those things: vision, balance, marketing, and in my mind, process.
Amazing. And now I'm going to leave exactly that tech bit you mentioned onto Louis, who's going to ask you, questions on exactly that. One, the process in engineering Scrum, and secondly, how thinking about this product lens that you mentioned earlier, how tech teams were really organized at Salesforce from a dev standpoint, from an analytics standpoint versus data science versus devs. So I'll leave it on to Louis to really deep dive a little bit onto this whole engineering Scrum side and the tech bit.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's a great change in a company, just to distribute like responsibilities between teams. How would you say like responsibilities were distributed across the company, between teams, between developers, between analytics, data science, maybe if that, I mean, I don't know if it existed yet at that
absolutely.
time. We were always late in France compared to the US. So I think at that time, data science was not a real thing in France, but it was already a thing in the US. So
yeah. Okay. There's a lot in there. Let me try and unpack it a little bit. So first, I'll get it out of the way, but Salesforce had a a near-death experience in his prior life that they kind of solved by doing Scrum. And I thought they had a fantastic process. And basically, when you have strong process, people work for the process. You don't work for your boss. So I would actually argue that, and that's a very important distinction because it means the org chart matters less. Right? When we're all working for a well-defined process, we don't ask our boss what we're supposed to do. We look at what phase we're in the process in, and we see what our responsibilities are. So it is a great mechanism to derive collaboration across an organization. And I have to say, there's one thing I learned at both Business Objects as we scaled and at Salesforce is the bigger you get, and this may be obvious, the more collaboration matters. In a little company, you have one boss, you ask them what to do, they tell you, right? In a large company, I mean, the question I always had at Business Objects was, who's the French country marketing manager's boss? Is it the country manager of France or the CMO? Right. And the answer, in my opinion, is both. And if you can't handle that answer, get a new job because that is the job. Right. So when you are a product GM at Salesforce, you have a lot of kind of notional power, right? You have a quota for a product line, but very few people actually work for you. So you be very good at collaboration. And that was the single biggest difference between being a real CEO, where everyone worked for me, and being a cloud CEO, where only jokingly, no one worked for me. The only people who actually worked for me were product managers. So I had a team of maybe 20 product managers. There's an 85-person overlay sales force that reported to sales. So I needed to be very close and was very close to the head of that sales, right? There was a customer success team dedicated to my product, right? So you're effectively a direct manager of PM and kind of an indirect manager of other functions. And then even engineering, I don't even think you're managing it. I think you're just both working for the same process. And engineering reported up to Parker. So none of my developers work for me, my QA people, none of that, but they were on my team, right? And they knew that, and I knew that. So I think it was a very interesting model in collaboration. And the other thing I liked about the model was it was highly ratio driven. There's two things I liked. One, it was highly collaborative by design, that we kind of designed an org that made sense, basically emphasizing functional excellence, I would say. And then product alignment came through the virtual team. So process was one big part of it. And the other big, look, as a former kind of closet FP&A person, the other thing I liked about it was ratio driven, which I think is super important to scaling.
Yeah, and so tell us a little bit more about those ratios. I mean, companies and especially scale-ups differ largely in how they're organized. I've gone to a panel once on Revolut versus Monzo, and at the time when they were both very similar companies, their tech teams were structured it couldn't be more opposite. So in terms of squads, or top-down approach, kind of mini data science product hubs. So these ratios at Salesforce, what do you think today might have been a really good way of structuring these ratios between QE and devs and PMs and devs? And I suspect there's not one single way to do it, but maybe one thing that works really well at Salesforce while you were there.
Sure. So first, as mentioned, I love ratios. Second, in go-to-market, we use them all the time. Right? Like go-to-market organizations, how many SDRs per AE, how many SEs per AE, how many CSMs, how many consultants, right? So in most companies, the GTM, the go-to-market side of the business is highly ratio-driven, which is, in my mind, great for two reasons. One, it makes it really easy to do planning. And two, you have this notion of a unit of scaling. Like you're creating it's not the developer or the sales rep, it's the sales rep plus supporting resources, kind of called a pod or an atom. So you create this notion of a unit of scaling because these things need to scale in ratios. So anyway, so I love ratio-driven engineering, and Salesforce did it. And by the way, they weren't kind of a slave to the ratios. You could always argue for intelligent exceptions, which is important. Much as I love ratios and I love rules of thumb, they're rules of thumb. There's time to break them. So at Salesforce, it was all driven off devs, which is the right way to do it. We should drive in sales, we should drive ratios off AEs, right? I would say how many quota carrying salespeople? To me, it's code writing developers, right? Those are the two core engines. And then all ratios are driven off those two engines. At Salesforce, I'll just tell you the numbers because I remember them. It was 2/3 of a quality engineer per dev, 1/3 of a PM per dev. So meaning 3 devs per PM, 1/8 of a documentation person per dev, 1/8 of a user experience person, 1/8 of a perf edge person. Particularly Salesforce, this is always sensitive. because they had to keep the system up and running, and that wasn't very easy. so to catch that on the front end, we had perf-eng people watching how stuff was built with an eye towards scaling it. First time I'd seen that, because it was the first time I was at a SaaS company. So that was very interesting. And then we had a tenth of a TPM, a technical product manager, per dev. And they were more like the process people to keep everything. They ran the Scrum meetings, they ran the sprint reviews, et cetera. So basically, if you net those numbers out, a 10 developer team would have about 7 QEs, 3 PMs, 1 doc, 1 UE, 1 perf-eng, and 1 TPM. And there's a metric I like to create, which I call developer density. And I do the same thing in go-to-market. I call it AE density, which is the number of the people doing the job divided by the total size of the org. Right. So how many quota-carrying salespeople do you have divided by the size of your sales team? How many developers do you have divided by the size of your engineering team? And that, if you use the Salesforce ratios, it pops out what I think is the right answer in general, which is 40%, which shocks some people because they're like, oh my God, only 40% of our engineers are writing code, right? Certainly as a small company, that wouldn't be true. But at scale, and as you scale, it's actually a pretty good rule of thumb, and you'll be surprised how many people fall below 40%.
Yeah, well, we're going to pause there, actually. And I'm going to ask this question to Louis. Do you think that these are good ratios, and would you challenge them in any way?
I think I've mostly worked in smaller companies, including mine. And I would guess that in my experience, when you are like less than 5 people, it's usually good to have at least 3 or 4 of them writing code. Yeah, I think we have. But I think, and actually the opposite is sadly sometimes true in some small tech companies where you have like 2 non-technical founders and only 1 technical founder. And I think just it's okay if you just grow fast enough and you can just hire more people. But if you just try to launch some great tech products and you are just like 1 technical person, it's just not enough in general. But it's kind of the same thing going on in AI, especially like right now when you are like building big products like, for example, Llama or Mistral. You would think that most of the people working there are just like AI researchers. And actually, it's just totally the opposite. You have like especially when you work with like transformers, which are like the very hot model for LLM right now. Actually, you have maybe like 1 AI scientist who gives like good ideas, and then you would have like at least like 4 or maybe 5, just like 4 engineers just to scale like the infrastructure and the implementation and handle like, maybe you would need like 1, just say like network engineer, just to be sure that the bandwidth is working correctly, and there's just like other people just working on data quality. So basically, if you think about AI startups right now, we're just doing LLM. I think the ratio of people doing like the smart stuff to the supporting people is just maybe like 1/10. So it's just like not even 40%.
So it's more support intensive. Interesting. Yeah.
I mean, but of course I include like AI engineers in like support, but yeah.
So look, I mean, the moral. So first, I'm never proclaiming these ratios are timeless and correct for all companies. The part that I think is timeless is it's good to have ratio-driven engineering org, and I would encourage listeners to, as you hit some scale, because you're correct. First, at small scale, you want to be very dev heavy. Like you start with 100. Let's be clear. Just like in sales, you start at 100. You get 1 person and they sell. But I think it's a good conversation for management teams to have, because as you grow, and if your AI company hits the hockey stick and takes off, you're going to have answers to these questions, because you will need some unit of scaling. Otherwise, it's just going to be, I can tell you what happens if you don't. It's just kind of a political mess where the head of development fights for more resources, the head of doc fights for more resources, right? It's just kind of a rugby scrum where everyone's in your office fighting for more resources and you have no reference frame.
Amazing. That's really interesting. So everyone, ratio-driven companies, especially in the engineering team, and there's no secret sauce, but But these are some of the, you could use some of Dave's metrics maybe to try things out, test and learn. And on this, this tech point gets us to some of the pain points faced in structuring these teams. So to give an anecdote at Amazon where I worked, I think some of these, tech pain points we've discussed, Dave, are very similar. And naming a few, we want to drill down. One of them in particular is getting resources. And a second I can think about at Amazon is just creating teams that are efficient, where people understand what's being done, and in a quite vertical way to report all the way back up to management. So I wanted to drill down with you a little bit on, the three main things that were really hard at Salesforce to structure tech teams and tech pain points in general.
Yeah. So I think the three things would be, first, as you mentioned one already, getting resources. And as somebody who ran a financial planning company for years, this breaks my heart. But at scale, you'll find budgeting processes are almost always top down. And Salesforce was no exception. I never even got to have a meeting where I argued how many developers I could have. Right, that maybe my boss got that meeting. I'm not even sure if he did. But the problem that I was handed in the budgeting process was, you get 31 devs, and that's how many devs I had for a $500 million business. I had 31 devs, right? So at a 40% density. Oh God, what is that? I'd say maybe 80 people in the total organization supporting a $500 million business, which I thought was pretty small, right? But anyway, the problem statement was not how many devs can you have and what return on investment will we get on additional devs, which is the correct problem statement in my mind. The real life problem statement is, you get 31, what do you want to do with them? So the budgeting process was really kind of a product planning process of, okay, given 31 devs, here are the 5 areas of my product. Here's the knowledge base. Here's case management. Here's computer telephony integration. Here's customer service portal. Here's how I want to deploy those devs. And here's what I want to do with them. One of the other things, I'll just do a quick aside on this, Salesforce did well, is what they call a 3RRR, a 3-release roadmap review. And that was really good, because I think the occupational hazard of running Scrum is you end up driving, looking at the hood ornament, right? You're always looking at the next release, and you never think to look a few releases out. So in some ways, the budgeting process was a 3RRR. They're saying, okay, over the next year, what do you want to do? Not for the next, sprint or not for the next release, but over the next year. So that was always hard. The other thing that was particularly hard at Salesforce is what I call a bright, shiny object company. I mean, people get distracted by bright, shiny objects, and Benioff was kind of the quintessential bright, shiny object person. So literally, one day you'd come to work and 2 of your Scrum teams would be gone working on Chatter. That actually happened. We're literally, because Mark goes, we got to have social enterprise. We need social. We need to build Chatter. I need 100 devs overnight. How do I get them? Boom, 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 cherry pick the org, and one day you come in and find out that 2 of your Scrum teams are gone. So that was difficult, because Mark was chasing the bright, shiny objects, kind of the dark side of the Mark is great visionary stepping in front of the parade. And to Mark's credit, when he steps in front of a parade, a lot of CEOs don't put any backing behind it. Right, they just go tell the story. They don't invest. Mark actually invested. We had 100 developers on Chatter when I was there. Total failure in my mind. Different question, but he was not afraid to put wood behind the arrow, and that had some downsides, including the fact that there was this thing called the True to the Core movement that happened, I think, in 2011, where the customers got tired of writing annual subscription checks and having the development money all go into bright, shiny objects. And they said, we want overlay forecasting. We want territory management. We want all these basic things in the sales module that are unsexy and unexciting, and therefore you don't want to build them. So it was very interesting to see Mark pushed it so hard towards the bright, shiny objects. There was basically a little rebellion, which they managed well, and they got the message. So that was the first thing that was hard, was getting resources. You want to talk about that more, or you want to talk about the next one?
No, I think that really resonates. Louis, any additional comments?
Yeah, it just reminds me of, on a different scale, I think it's Paul Graham who say that you have to focus on the hard things, not the sexy stuff, That's how Stripe was made, basically. Just It took the most boring program ever, like payments, and to just focus on that.
Look, I think there'll be a lot of people who disagree with us, but I'll tell you my opinion. The key difference, and I don't know Larry Ellison personally, but I'm a database guy, and I grew up in the databases competing against him, and I have lots of friends who work for him. I think the difference between Larry Ellison and Mark Benioff is Larry Ellison always understood the core was the database, And I don't think Mark felt the same way about SFA. The best people at Oracle worked on the database. The smartest people worked on the database. It was an elite team inside the company, right? Like they never forgot that the whole thing began and ended with the database. And I think Salesforce was almost so far the other way that they're like, oh yeah, don't forget we gotta put overlay forecasting into the Sales Cloud, right? Sales Cloud. I told you I was 500 million. I had 31 devs. Sales Cloud was 2 billion. Also had 31 devs. Chatter had 100. Platform had 100. Right, just to give you real numbers. So I felt bad for me, and I looked at my colleague Linda sitting next to me, and I'm like, "You're driving $2 billion in revenue, and you've only got 31 devs, right?" So I think, and by the way, in core engineering, you don't measure investment by team size, right? That's why I emphasize the database team at Oracle. It wasn't that big, but it was super elite, and they were very, very, very good, which is required when you build platform software. So in any case, I think, and by the way, the good news for Benioff is he had enough really smart people who he listened to around him to correct, but it was not innate to him. I think it was innate to Ellison to understand the database was the core. To Benioff, it was not as innate, and partly because, in my opinion, his job was to be the bright, shiny object guy at Oracle. But anyway, that kind of was his role.
Yeah.
Second thing that was hard to answer your question is the platform team, and this is an interesting pattern. Which is in a lot of software companies, you end up with some sort of internal platform, and you, on top of which you build your applications. And one question is, do you externalize that? Do you sell the APIs to it? Does it become a product? And for Salesforce, the answer was obviously yes. Many would argue it was one of the handful of key success factors for the company was platformizing CRM. So awesome, all good. But the problem is when you're an internal person like me running the Service Cloud, you have priorities you need from the platform team. And I'll give you a real example that was very hard for us to get. And at the time, I did not succeed in getting it, which was lead routing. Not lead routing, sorry, case routing with Service Cloud. And we needed to route cases to the right agent, right? Like what's it about? What language does the customer speak? How hard is it? I need rules for taking a case and getting it to the right agent in a 1,000-person call center. It's not easy. In fact, in my first sales call, I went to see Qualcomm, and they had a person, I met him, whose full-time job was writing case routing rules. That's how bad our system was. Full-time job. What do? I write case routing rules for the Service Cloud at Qualcomm. And it's like, oh my God, we got to fix this. We need a case routing engine. And then I talked to Linda, who sat next to me, and she's like, well, I need a lead routing engine because lead routing is a lot like case routing. Right? How do I get the lead to the right SDR, basically? So we go to platform people and say, hey, we need a routing engine, a generic routing engine, right? Any basic software architect would say, oh, you need a routing engine, and it needs to be able to route cases, route leads, and maybe route some other things we haven't talked about. And we could never get it. And this is, I tell this story because it's so interesting because you want to have this platform team internally, but and particularly when they are selling the product directly, which they were, they kind of have a conflict of interest between driving direct platform sales, right? Like we signed a big platform customer to go build stuff versus I helped the Service Cloud get an important feature that, there's no sex, there's no reward, there's no award for just taking care of your internal customers. So we never got it. And I don't know if we built it redundantly in the end or not. I left, but I just think it's just a classic dysfunction pattern, and you have to be careful what you ask for. We could have done a better job at deciding what the platform team built to serve the other clouds versus serve their own interests. And I think we over-rotated towards their own interests.
I think that really resonates with of us, and that second challenge you mentioned on platform teams. And I guess the third one I wanted to hear in particular, and you spoke about Mark earlier, and one anecdote about Mark that might be fun that you were able to share while you were at Salesforce.
Sure, I think the anecdote is more about the company and the process than Mark personally, but I can tell you the anecdote because I know the one you're talking about. It had to do with M&A, and this is the third thing that's hard when you're a cloud GM as opposed to a CEO. Most big companies have a corporate development team whose job is to go shopping for companies, right? That's what they do. And that's a parallel process to product management, right? They're kind of off doing their thing, looking at who's for sale, talking to bankers, kind of monitoring supply, if you will. And the GMs are working on demand, like, oh my God, I need co-browsing, right? Or I need field service module. Those are the things we were worried about. And the key to big companies is intersecting them, right? And the funny story I had was this is one of my grumpier days at Salesforce, was I had heard that Mark had met via the corp dev guys with a co-browsing company, And he really liked the founder, which I did too. I later got to know him. And Mark kind of decided we were going to buy the co-browsing company. So I went to a product offsite the next day, and I'm like, well, what do I do with this information? Because I'm asked to make an M&A priority list. And I know that we're about to buy a co-browsing company. Co-browsing was not particularly high on our list. It was like number 7 or number 8. But I'm like, well, shit, this is going to happen anyway, so I'll put it at number 1. I proceed to get torn apart for having put it as number 1, and then like 2 days later, we buy the company, and I'm like, oh, this is the stress of working in a large company, right? Which is I know that the left hand is going to go buy this company. I'm trying to synchronize with it. It's not the greatest idea for the right hand, and then I get blasted for it, not being a great idea. So, funny story, a little bit more about M&A process than anything else, and I have to say I was so mad that I didn't talk to my boss on the private jet all the way home. So the advantage of the big company, we were flying back at I think it was a Global 5000 or some amazing private jet from the meeting. But I was mad because the whole thing was just my insanity to me. Like wait a minute, I'm just trying to adapt to this process and all the pieces make sense to me, right? You need corp dev, you need GMs, but somehow that has to come together a little better.
Amazing. Well, no private jets in sight here. Well, not much M&A going on right now in Europe. So, that's great. I imagine there must have been quite a lot of M&A activity at the time relative to now.
Yeah, there was quite a bit of M&A. We were on the private jet to visit a company we'd acquired in Eastern Canada. So that's why we happened to be on it, because there was no other way to get to where it was, Fredericton, Alberta, or wherever. No, Fredericton. I'm missing up the province, but it was far. It was like a 6.5-hour flight.
Yeah, amazing. And speaking of that, cultural differences, US versus France. Do you see any cultural differences in the way things are set up? You were on the advising Aircall and some of these companies that are both in France and in the US.
So Fredericton is in Labrador and Newfoundland, by the way, really far in Eastern Canada. I don't see a lot of differences. I don't do that much work on the tech side at Balderton, right? And I do work with some French companies outside of Balderton, but and I may just sound like a typical go-to-market person, but it all seems roughly the same. I was very interested to hear you guys talk about the difference how an AI company is structured. That's super interesting to me and new. But for just classic enterprise software, as far as I can tell, things tend to be structured the same from what I see. Again, I spend probably 3 times as much time in go-to-market as I do on product, but I don't see any obvious differences.
Amazing. Louis, do you spot any? You've worked in France. There's also
yeah, I didn't quite work for any US company, so I don't have any inputs on that.
Yeah. No, I think there's what I'm seeing at least, or I've seen as having worked a little bit in the US, is definitely leveraging some of the tech force here in Europe, of course, in Western Europe, but also in Central Eastern Europe. So a lot of engineering talent. So sometimes structuring the tech teams in a hybrid way. In terms of time zones. So
absolutely, global teams are definitely the norm at any scale, and I do think that a global team changes those ratios as well. So when you're having that ratio conversation, I think it changes a lot depending on where, and if nothing else, for cost reasons, in terms of where and how you can put people.
Yeah, exactly. For those listening, how big is Salesforce now versus when you were there in 2012? Do you have any numbers in terms of these tech teams? And do you have any comments on Salesforce performance now versus 2012?
Yeah. Well, I kept all my shares that I acquired from options, put it that way. I've tried never to sell a share in Salesforce. And I did that because I always felt that Salesforce was kind of Luke Skywalker destined to be Oracle, right? There's just so many things about Salesforce that is repeating the Oracle pattern. And say what you will about Oracle, but it's been a pretty good investment over the last 30 years. And I always thought that Salesforce would be. I mean, they're now doing $9 billion in revenue a quarter. So it was $3 billion a year when I was there. So they're now doing 9 times 4 is 36. They're 12 times bigger than they were when I was there. So they are now a massive company. I would say they're kind of a mid-size, right? Maybe $3 billion in ARR. I don't know what's OpenAI is that today, but probably bad comparison. But they were a at scale single-digit billion company, and now they're becoming a behemoth. I have no idea if the ratios have changed. I'm pretty sure they have changed, but I'll bet you $1 they're still ratio driven. And in terms of headcount, I think it's up to 75,000 people. It was 6,000 when I was there, so also 12 times bigger. So that scaled. They scaled people with revenue somehow. I suspect it's more profitable now. But And I think they've done a great job. I mean, running the Oracle play. I mean, what was the Oracle play? Be dominant in databases, fail in applications, with few people know these days. But Oracle tried to build applications, it just failed miserably, and that's why they started the M&A spree, because they actually couldn't build their own applications. So Salesforce did a tremendous job in CRM, had trouble building outside of CRM, and has been doing acquisitions kind of both within CRM in the areas that they need top ups and building beyond it. And the other thing I'd say is in common is they do incomprehensibly large deals. And Oracle does that. So much of enterprise sales is kind of believing what you can charge. And when I was there, we did the largest deal in the then history of the company. There was something like $40 million deal, and we did that all on Service Cloud. So, and then remember, the sales rep received a $4 million commission check on the stage with Benny, a $4 million commission check. Talk about motivating a sales force. But they still have that culture. They still try to do big deals. And to me, it's basically running the Oracle play. And look, the net lesson for that for startups is always, to me, one day you're going to do a $40 million deal if you're successful. You can't possibly believe that right now. But the moral is you can charge a lot more for what you're selling than you think. And that's the lesson I take from it. It was true every year at Business Objects. I think it was true at Salesforce. In enterprise software, if you solve a big problem for big enterprises, you're probably undercharging relative to value, which means the clearer you are as a market leader, the more you'll be able to charge. And Salesforce is fantastic at that, as was Oracle.
Amazing. Well, that draws us to a close of the Salesforce episode, and we'll be having a next episode with you, Dave, on the history of databases. So going a bit more in depth in some of these juicy topics. But before saying bye, we had one question for you. What are your 3 favorite books?
So it's a hard question to answer. I'd say first, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummelt. If you could only read one book on strategy, this is it. And I like it because it tears apart all the crap that passes as strategy that isn't. So must read book. Playing to Win is a book by the CEO of Procter & Gamble on how to win in markets. Fantastic, applied, not conceptual. Most tech books are full of metaphors, the chasm, the crux, everybody's got their metaphor, category kings, gorillas. Like, we love metaphors in tech. This is kind of a metaphor-free how to win in your market book. And the last will surprise you. It's a book called Words That Work by an American political pollster who spends, I would say, probably 75% of his time in focus groups. Like, this guy travels and does focus groups all day long about politics, and he's really good at data-driven marketing. And the data he's trying to figure out in particular is what words, what ways of saying things affect how people respond to them. And as a marketer, you are a word meister, and it is a very important book. I'll tell you, the guy's a Republican pollster, so some people don't like him because of his politics. I don't care about his politics. I think he's an excellent data-driven analyst, and therefore I like his book.
Amazing. Thanks for that.
Okay,
well,
great.
Yeah, please stay tuned for our next episode for all those listening, because Louis will be sharing his 3 favorite books. So you have to listen to the next episode. And Dave will be sharing all about history of databases, databases you might have never heard about.
I look forward to talking about databases with you. That'll be fun.
Stay tuned, everyone. Thanks for listening to us.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.